All right, well, I'm back in my home studio today, and a lot of stuff going on in Israel. I talked about a lot of it in my weekly update, and a lot of stuff is going on in America. And I think it's sort of time to talk about what's going on in the United States. Last week, we saw Trump arraigned in the Fulton County court, and, we got his mugshot up and all of this unprecedented stuff. And we also have more and more information coming out about Joe Biden and what his various hijinks were as vice president in terms of influence peddling with his son, Hunter Biden, who, of course, is a crackhead, and apparently with his brother, Jim. And the House of Representatives is investigating, and they're talking about maybe impeaching him. So I think, when we talk about Israel is always seen, particularly from a strategic perspective, in the context of its alliance with the United States. And Israelis are wont to say, we can't manage without America, or America, their strategic alliance with Israel is the most important guarantor of our national security. I, of course, take great issue with those claims, but there's this concept that America is this global superpower that can do anything, and that, is a reliable ally for Israel, and of course the world's most powerful democracy. But there's a lot of stuff going on inside of the United States today that's really challenging it's the stability of its constitutional republic from various angles. And so to discuss this issue, because I think that understanding the status of the United States and its political system and its politics and its legal system is critical to understanding the context, the global context in which world events have to be seen. And the person that I go to, or one of the few people that I go to for sage advice on American politics specifically, is my friend and my old colleague also at Breitbart, Joel Pollak. Joel Pollak is a senior columnist, and I think the general counsel for Breitbart's news network, and again, a very good and old friend of mine. And this is his first visit to the Caroline Glick Show. So first of all, let's all give a warm welcome to Joel Pollak. Hey, Joel.
It's great to be here. Hi. Shalom.
Hi, shalom. And you're in Los Angeles these days, which is one of the megalopolises of California that has seen better days.
Well, we're in a very beautiful part of LA called Pacific Palisades. We live at something of a remove from what's going on in the rest of the city. I live on a hillside overlooking the Pacific Ocean, so things look pretty nice here just about every day. That's not to say we don't have problems as well, but if you're going to find a city to live in, this is the part of the city that you want to live in. So yes, but we are having a lot of trouble, not just in LA, but throughout urban America, where governance is basically collapsing.
Well, hopefully we can get to that. I want to try to get to that at the end, but first I want to talk about it at the national level. So can you give us sort of a bird's eye view of what's going on with the investigations of Joe Biden? And I mean, because what I saw last week was that now it's come out from, I think, State Department communications that came out that actually Joe Biden's interference with the Ukrainian justice system, when he got Viktor Shokin, a prosecutor there, fired, Shokin was investigating a company that had employed his son, Hunter, in a very, 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 very lucrative contract for apparently nothing. So he fired Shokin, and the investigation of Burisma, the firm, was ended. And the State Department actually opposed that because they thought that Shokin was doing a good job of fighting corruption in Ukraine. And this was when he was vice president. So that looks to me like as smoking a gun that I can remember seeing. But can you just talk about this latest revelation and sort of the context of everything that's being investigated about his family and him?
Sure. Well, let's take a step back and look at how the Bidens have used Joe Biden's political career to enrich themselves. James Biden, who is Joe Biden's brother, has obtained contracts overseas largely through his association with his brother. And Hunter Biden came along, one of the two sons, surviving children of Joe Biden, and he found his way onto the board of Burisma, a large energy company in Ukraine. And this happened at a time when Joe Biden was vice president and Barack Obama, President Obama, had placed him in charge of Ukraine policy. Obama often did this with important areas of policy. He placed Biden in charge of the massive stimulus of 2009, for example, and this was a way for Obama to avoid any blame for things if they went wrong while appearing to take something seriously. Obama's Ukraine policy was a disaster, if you remember, because he allowed Russia to invade and take Crimea with barely any resistance at all. My favorite or least favorite part of the entire episode was Secretary of State John Kerry going on TV and complaining that Russian President Vladimir Putin was operating by 19th century rules, as if there were some kind of rules in the world of conflict and diplomacy that Putin had to abide by, and if he didn't, he was breaking the rules somehow. I mean, it was so amateurish. Anyway, Biden was in charge of Ukraine policy, and there was one day after Hunter Biden was appointed to this board where journalists asked Jay Carney, who was then the White House press secretary, about this apparent conflict of interest. How is Joe Biden going to be in charge of Ukraine policy when his son, Hunter, is on the board of a major Ukrainian energy company? That question was never answered. It was deflected from the White House to the vice president's office, and he never answered the question. We later learned in the impeachment investigation into Donald Trump from the testimony of several State Department witnesses that they too had raised the question of Hunter Biden's role in Burisma, because Joe Biden, when he was in charge of Ukraine, was trying to project an image of clean government, was trying to tell the Ukrainians that if they got rid of corruption, they would be better able to resist Russian invasion and pressure. So some State Department officials said, hey, it doesn't look very good that we're telling the Ukrainians not to use corruption and nepotism, and the vice president's son is on the board of Burisma. Now, there was reporting going on at Breitbart at the time to follow up on two leads. One was reporting that Hunter Biden had a serious drug problem, and we were among the first to report that there was a rental car he had turned back in that had drug paraphernalia inside, and there was a problem with it. We had a source who came to us with the story. We ran with the story. Meanwhile, my colleague Peter Schweitzer, who's documented a lot of corruption both among Republicans and Democrats over the years, documented the fact that Hunter Biden seemed to take a lot of trips with Joe Biden on Air Force Two, and he went to China in particular and walked away with a deal worth $1.5 billion. So it looked like Hunter Biden was using his father's position and influence to gain access to foreign deals. This was all happening in the background, and some of it was being reported. And then in 2019, The Hill, which is a publication that writes about American politics, published an opinion article documenting a speech by Joe Biden at the Council of Foreign Relations the year before, 2018, when he boasted about getting rid of a Ukrainian prosecutor. He appeared to be boasting that he had used $1 billion in U.S. loan guarantees to get rid of a prosecutor who wasn't playing along with American policy, whatever the policy was at that moment. But that prosecutor had jurisdiction over ongoing investigations into Burisma, the very company that Hunter Biden was serving on the board of, and that his business partner, Devon Archer, was also on the board of. Now, Democrats later would claim that Joe Biden was operating in the anti-corruption mode that was shared in common with other Western nations, and that this prosecutor, Viktor Shokin, was part of the problem. He wasn't investigating Burisma hard enough. Well, whatever the real story is, and it's very hard to know with Ukraine, we've seen more evidence come out in recent days that Burisma was in fact being investigated by Viktor Shokin, and certainly the Burisma executives who hired Hunter Biden expected that he would help influence his father to do something about
They had the whole thing. I mean, Devon Archer gave testimony before Congress, the congressional investigators, 2 weeks ago, and he And he said that Joe Biden had participated in meetings. He stopped in at a dinner, and was it he or the whistleblowers from the IRS who said that Joe Biden they had said that they were worried about the prosecutor, and that Hunter Biden said that he would put in a call to Washington. So you had, you've already seen evidence that he was involved, that they perceived him as being on their side and willing to bring his influence to bear.
That's correct. And there are some serious political implications of this, because the first impeachment of President Donald Trump was for a phone call that he had with newly elected Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, in which Trump said he wanted to know what was going on with Joe Biden and Hunter Biden. And Democrats accused President Trump of withholding military aid to Ukraine until he got an answer, until there was an announcement about an investigation. Now, Trump never actually withheld with the military aid from Ukraine. In fact, he was the first to give weapons to Ukraine. Obama sent blankets and rations. Trump sent anti-tank missiles. And even in that summer, when some of the aid was delayed, along with aid to other countries, it was future financial assistance for security operations. It wasn't weapons. The aid was delivered anyway, but that was the claim made by Democrats, that Trump had made up these charges and wanted Zelensky to produce some kind of a false investigation to smear Joe Biden ahead of the 2020 presidential election. Now it has come out through the testimony of Devon Archer, as well as other sources of information like the IRS whistleblowers you mentioned, that what Trump was saying was substantially true, that Hunter Biden had been placed on this board and was using the money that he gained from this board to enrich himself and possibly to enrich his family as well. Other evidence came out of other Hunter Biden businesses that were earning money overseas, where the money came into accounts that were shuffled through various different shell companies, up to 20 shell companies, and then deposited in the bank accounts of various Biden family members, including children who had no role whatsoever in the business. And Joe Biden claims that he never saw a cent of any of this money, but of course, his family was certainly enriched by it. And at Joe Biden's age, the financial goal for many people of that age is to pass wealth on to your children and grandchildren, not necessarily to accumulate it for yourself. So this was a way for Joe Biden, it looked like a way for Joe Biden to use Hunter Biden to pull in the money and then to have that money distributed around the family. The IRS whistleblowers were very important because what was going to happen, we've now learned, was the U.S. attorney who was investigating Hunter Biden for failing to file taxes had decided that he was going to strike a plea deal with Hunter Biden where he would plead guilty to misdemeanors, minor offenses. Nobody else, by the way, would be allowed to do that for these crimes. They would be felonies. But he would be allowed to plead guilty, and he would never serve a day in jail. He also was being investigated for a firearms violation. He would not have to serve time for that, even though that's a felony. He would be in a diversion program.
I think it's worth noting because it also speaks to his competence as a member of any board of directors, not to mention of an energy concern or the $1 billion deal that he was closing with the Chinese. Is that that firearms violation was that on an application when he purchased a firearm in the state of Delaware, he said that he wasn't an active drug user, and in fact he was actively using cocaine at the time. He was an addict. So that also is a very serious felony. And again, it speaks to his competence to be doing any of the business dealings that he was engaged in during that period, I think.
Caroline, this was such a sweetheart deal that the firearms violation he was going to plead guilty for wasn't even lying on the form. Because as an active member of the bar, as a practicing attorney, Hunter Biden might be disbarred if he had to plead guilty to a crime of lying on a form, which is a form of perjury or fraud. What he was going to plead guilty to was not that, but being a substance user while owning a firearm, which is a separate offense that doesn't actually involve dishonesty. And so the Department of Justice was going to give him the sweetheart deal, and included in the fine print of an annex to the deal was a promise never to prosecute him again for anything related to any of this, whether it was the money from Ukraine or from China or the firearms, any of it. He was getting a get-out-of-jail-free card. And this was all going to go down in an office that had already allowed the statute of limitations to expire on several of Hunter Biden's tax violations that wasn't including probably the most serious violation of all, which is failing to register as a foreign agent, which would have pointed directly to the influence peddling he was doing with his father. And you mentioned competence. Hunter Biden was appointed to Burisma after he was discharged from the U.S. Navy for testing positive for cocaine. So why would any company hire someone who had just lost their last job for drug use? It's unbelievable. And the only reason is that he is Joe Biden's son. So these IRS whistleblowers uncovered the deal that was going on. And they basically reported that all kinds of problems were being thrown in their way when they tried to investigate Hunter Biden's tax violations, that these wouldn't have happened, like lawyers from the Department of Justice tipping off Hunter Biden's attorneys that they knew where certain documents were and they should go get them, like Biden campaign members being tipped off about imminent meetings that FBI agents or IRS investigators wanted to have with Hunter Biden. They weren't able to interview any of the witnesses except one witness in the investigation. So there were all these obstacles thrown in their way. And once their testimony came out in public, the judge in Delaware said, hang on a second, I want to see what this plea bargain is all about. And it transpired that the Department of Justice under U.S. Attorney David Weiss, who, by the way, is a Trump appointee. Democrats make a big deal out of him being a Trump appointee, as if that means he's loyal to Trump. I mean, the idea somehow that these prosecutors are politically loyal to the person that appointed them is one that Democrats would resist in any other circumstance. You know, if you point out that left-wing judges appointed by Joe Biden are going to come down a certain way on certain issues, you're accused of politicizing the judiciary. And yet they say that this David Weiss, who was appointed by Trump, that means he's loyal to Trump. So if he didn't prosecute, that must have meant that there was nothing there to prosecute. But of course, many Trump appointees...
It's actually ironic on two scores. One is that Trump, almost none of the appointments that Trump made, or at least it's screaming out to me, are like, I don't know, a dozen or more appointments that he made, which were people who were deeply disloyal to him. It just speaks to poor judgment. But aside from that, you know, you are seeing extraordinary partisan loyalty among some of the judges that and Justice Department officials in the Justice Department under Biden to the Democrats and to Joe Biden himself. So I think that it's the pot calling the kettle black here. You know,
there's a difference in philosophy between Republicans and Democrats when it comes to presidential appointments, including judicial appointments. Republicans view themselves as serving the institution. Democrats view themselves as serving the party. And for Democrats, the line between party and state basically doesn't exist. So when you receive a Democratic appointment from a Democratic administration, you're expected roughly to follow the political line of the party. That's why the Supreme Court justices who are appointed by Democrats almost always vote in a bloc. Whereas Republicans who care theoretically about these institutions don't do that. And keep in mind, Trump showed poor judgment in some of his appointments, but in some cases he didn't have a choice. He came into office with a very small group of people. Much of the Republican establishment had openly said they would not work in his administration. And so there were very few people to choose from in serving in various positions. He left some positions unfilled, but when it came to positions that needed to be filled, the list of Republicans was placed before him, and he sometimes had to choose people who were not particularly loyal or whose loyalty he didn't know. And again, Republicans also don't tend to think about political loyalty when making these kinds of appointments. But anyway, David Weiss had conspired essentially to hide the terms of this plea deal from the judge. They just presented this to the judge, and she forced them essentially to explain its terms to her, but they hadn't really given it to her very well in advance where she could have studied it. And they tried to put one over on her, essentially. They tried to slide it past her. And she stopped that and rejected the plea deal and told the parties to go back and renegotiate. I should add one other thing. The reason the IRS whistleblowers came out, or one of the other things they said, was that David Weiss had told them privately he did not have authority to prosecute Hunter Biden in other jurisdictions, like the District of Columbia or Central District of California, where some of the offenses had taken place. Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, who supposedly is depoliticizing the Department of Justice, said that that wasn't the case, that Weiss had all the authority he needed. So these whistleblowers were contradicting the Attorney General of the United States. And evidence has come out now that supports their story and not Merrick Garland's story. Now, with all of this transpiring...
But wait, let me just back up here, because Then what Merrick Garland did says, okay, then I'm appointing him a special prosecutor or a special investigator or whatever it is. That's supposed to be the status that makes him independent. But that status is supposed to be conferred to somebody who isn't in the line, isn't in the chain of command of the federal government. So that's
Right.
one weird thing. And the other weird thing is that, this is a guy who just set up a totally scandalous plea bargain with Hunter Biden, and now he's supposed to be given credibility to oversee a continuing investigation of him, a wider scoped investigation.
Department of Justice regulations say that a special counsel is supposed to be appointed from outside of government. Now, that hasn't always happened. There have been cases where special counsels have been appointed who work for the government. But in this case, Garland appointed the very person who was being accused of covering up Hunter Biden and Joe Biden's dealings to investigate the dealings. So Republicans said this is another way of furthering the cover-up, because effectively what it does is it shields David Weiss, the special counsel now, from having to testify in Congress about his prior investigation to this point. And he's going to say, well, I can't testify because now I'm special counsel and this investigation is ongoing. So it's a continuation of the cover-up.
So, okay, so that's what the Democrats are doing. That's what the Justice Department is doing. And we didn't even go into CEFC, the Chinese energy company that hired Hunter Biden, that, information about their contract and that Joe Biden was supposed to get a cut of that, 10% of what they brought in, that Tony Bobulinski told Tucker Carlson on the eve of the 2020 elections. And then
And
that
the laptop,
was also...
by the way, also is part of that, because the laptop that Hunter Biden left at a store in Delaware contained emails and information corroborating a lot of these accusations that he was using his father's influence to work with all these foreign companies and to arrange meetings with Ukrainian executives and Chinese executives and so forth.
And my friend Gal Luft, who's now on the lam, he came forward and gave all this information. He had been working with CEFC's nonprofit organization in D.C., which was run by the same people who run the company. And they had told him everything that Tony Bobulinski told Tucker Carlson, and that the laptop exposed. And he told them this a month before Joe Biden announced his candidacy. I think it was in March 2019. So, all of this stuff they knew, and they knew in advance. And what we've seen is this remarkable cover-up going on now, I guess, for 4 years, since 2019, when the information started coming out.
The chutzpah here is the Department of Justice is accusing Gal Luft of being a Chinese agent because he worked with these Chinese companies. But Hunter Biden and Joe Biden, who were entering into a joint venture with the same company, haven't been accused of anything. So
yeah, but that's not even so ironic, because Gal was working for their 501c3 nonprofit organization that was registered in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So he was working with a U.S. government registered nonprofit. And why would you register as a foreign agent when you're working with a U.S. entity? But leave that aside. So let's just say the Democrats are in cover-up mode. So what is Congressman James Comer and other senior and also the Speaker of the House? What are they planning on doing? Are they planning on impeaching Joe Biden? Where is this going in the year and plus until the election?
So there are two investigations going on right now. James Comer is the head of the House Oversight Committee, and he's been uncovering all the financial records that document these transactions with Hunter Biden and the Biden family and these foreign interests. Then you have Jim Jordan, representative of Ohio on the Republican side, who's running the Weaponization Subcommittee. This is a special investigation into the way that the Democrats were using the federal government to target their political opponents. And both of these investigations have uncovered all kinds of abuses. Now, I've been saying since January of this year, when it first came out that China sent $3 million, or a Chinese company sent $3 million to a Hunter Biden associate who then cycled the money through various shell companies and gave it to the Biden family. I've said there is now grounds for an impeachment inquiry into Joe Biden. Why? Because this is a foreign payment to benefit the president's family, And this is one of the specific grounds mentioned in the Constitution for impeaching a president. The other one is treason. So treason, bribery, and high crimes and misdemeanors. I didn't say we should impeach Joe Biden because I don't think that that sort of step would be viewed as legitimate by the American people. It would be seen as political in much the way that the Trump impeachments were seen as political. But what we learned in the Trump impeachment investigation is that once the House of Representatives authorizes an impeachment inquiry, it acquires subpoena powers that are much greater than those it requires under its ordinary legislative function. Right now, the various legislative committees of the House can order witnesses to appear through issuing subpoenas, but it can also subpoena the executive branch in a sweeping way. If it's exercising an impeachment function, it basically becomes like a grand jury itself. And so the only way to get to the bottom of what Joe Biden was doing and what Hunter Biden was doing is to authorize an impeachment inquiry, because you have to be able to go after the documents and witnesses, not just in the Biden White House, but in the Obama White House before that.
You were calling for this in January, and other people have been calling for it. I've been noticing for the past several months as well. And Kevin McCarthy, the Speaker of the House, hasn't ruled it out. The question is, where does it stand? Where do you see this going? Do you see it happening?
I think it's going to happen. And what's changed for a lot of people who were opposed to it before is that they now believe the Department of Justice cannot be trusted to handle this investigation on its own. And probably the most important person who changed his mind is a legal commentator named Jonathan Turley. He's a Fox News contributor, and he's very highly respected. He's a liberal. He's a professor at George Washington University Law School.
Sort of like a younger version of Alan Dershowitz, for people who are not aware of his work. I mean, in the sense that he's widely regarded as a liberal who's really a liberal. Like he still has his liberal
credentials,
sensibilities.
Right.
Yeah, but he is not a progressive. He hasn't gone over to that side.
So he made a big deal in recent months of telling Republicans not to impeach Joe Biden in a rushed way. And that's the same argument he made when Democrats tried to impeach Donald Trump. And he, in fact, appeared for the Republicans as a witness at the House Judiciary Committee in the first Trump impeachment, saying that these grounds were not adequate for impeachment on a constitutional basis. He had disagreed with Trump's policies and behavior, but he said this is not sufficient constitutionally for impeachment. So he's made this very strong case over both Democratic and Republican House administrations that they should not rush to impeach a president. But now he has said for the last week that given the evident cover-up and lack of credibility at the Department of Justice, that you cannot get an investigation from this Department of Justice, that Merrick Garland, by appointing David Weiss, the arsonist, to put out the fire, has essentially made it impossible for the public to trust whatever comes out of the Department of Justice about this. And now you have to use the impeachment power of the House. It's the only way to get to the bottom of what happened.
So that's interesting. So do you think that it's likely to happen in the near future that we're going to see an impeachment trial an impeachment procedure, and not yet a trial for Joe Biden?
I do think so. I think it's going to become inevitable in the next several weeks that you'll see an impeachment inquiry authorized on party line votes in the House of Representatives. But it is going to be tough. It's going to involve some arm twisting by Kevin McCarthy because he has a very small majority in the House, and there are a few Republicans who say that we shouldn't do this. And these are people like Representative Ken Buck of Colorado and others who are in swing districts who are scared of upsetting Democratic voters and doing something that looks like it's too political. But the more you have people like Turley coming on board, the more I think that Kevin McCarthy is going to be able to persuade people that this is just an inquiry, it's just a first step. It doesn't necessarily mean you're impeaching the president. But I think it's going to become necessary because otherwise there's no way to uncover not just what Joe Biden and Hunter Biden did, but what's going on in the Department of Justice. And it's looking pretty bad. It looks like the Department of Justice is coordinating in various ways with the Biden administration, both in how it's handling this investigation and in how it's handling the investigations into Donald Trump.
Right. So I wanted to actually segue from this question to Donald Trump. because, I mean, I, for one, I'm sure that a lot of other people in Israel, I don't know about Israel, but certainly in the United States and around the world probably were as appalled as I was seeing Donald Trump in Georgia last week, and the mugshot and the ugliness of it all, and all of his attorneys being getting their mugshots, and it's very unsettling. It's very terrifying, actually. Donald Trump, I think there are like 90 counts in indictments today. I think it was the Obama appointed what's her name, Chutnik, federal judge what's her name?
Chutkin
in Washington announced the opening of his trial for the day before Super Tuesday in the primaries, and you have the Georgia, the Fulton County DA saying that she wants to also have the trial. I mean, I don't know what is like the October surprise is going to be the opening of his RICO trial in Georgia, and he has another trial with a Democratic DA in Miami that's supposed to start in May. I mean, it's first of all, I want to look at this from two perspectives with you in our remaining time. The first one is the legal aspect to what's happening to Trump and what it means, and then I guess the political aspect of it. And then if we have time, I wouldn't mind going to the social aspect of all of this. If after we look at Trump and what's happening with him in the GOP race, what is happening to American society as we see this going forward. But let's start with the legal aspect of the indictments against Trump now in four different jurisdictions: in Miami, in New York City, in Washington, D.C., and now in Atlanta and Fulton County, Georgia.
So the first of these indictments came in New York, and the Manhattan District Attorney who ran for office, we elect our prosecutors here, he ran for office promising to put Donald Trump on trial. And he's now done that, but he's done it by twisting the law such that he's trying to charge Trump with federal campaign violations so that he can extend the statute of limitations in a state prosecution beyond the 2 years that he would have had to bring this case to a broader 7 years, I think it is. So in other words, he's prosecuting Trump for allegedly falsifying a business record by listing his hush money payments to Stormy Daniels, an actress in adult films who he supposedly had an affair with, as some kind of a campaign expense when it wasn't, or it was a personal expense. There's a 2-year statute of limitations on that crime in New York. That statute of limitations has expired. And the only way that he can extend it is if he prosecutes Trump for the felony version of that same crime. But there's no way to do it unless it involves some other form of fraud, and he's brought in the federal campaign law that he's going to try to use to enforce this. It's a legal mess. It's got no place in court. It wasn't prosecuted previously under district attorneys in the same office in Manhattan who were equally eager to get Trump because there's no case here. But he was under extreme pressure, Alvin Bragg was, and there was a former prosecutor who actually resigned from the department and wrote a book outlining the case against Trump as he saw it, and he wanted Bragg to prosecute Trump. So this is a completely politicized charge. It has no legal merit. It's embarrassing for Trump and for his family because it highlights this allegation of an affair with this actress, but it doesn't really have any place in court. I would expect that he could get a conviction fairly easily in a Manhattan courtroom because the jury hates Donald Trump. Typically, I mean, statistically, you get many more anti-Trump people in Manhattan than you would, let's say, in the middle of the country, but I don't think it could be upheld on appeal. The next case involves the federal special counsel who filed charges in Miami against Trump for allegedly mishandling classified documents. Now, Trump didn't destroy the documents. He's not accused of sharing them with enemies of the United States or selling them or distributing them. He's accused of waving one of these documents in front of a visiting journalist, which is the sort of most serious kind of conduct described in the indictment, but it's not really clear what he was waving or if it really was a classified document or whatever. And he's also accused of obstructing justice by moving his boxes of documents around his residence rather than simply handing everything over to the federal government, to the National Archives. There are some on the Republican side who say, well, this looks like a serious charge because you're supposed to cooperate with the National Archives when they need their documents and so forth. But the indictment doesn't mention the Presidential Records Act. And the Presidential Records Act gives the president authority to decide what is a government record and what is a personal record. And the reason they don't deal with that law, which was passed in 1978, is that it completely undermines their case. So Jack Smith, the special counsel, has made these charges, and he's trying to indict a whole bunch of other underlings. He indicted one of Trump's aides. He indicted the facilities manager of Mar-a-Lago. He indicted a guy who works on technical support in Mar-a-Lago, Trump's residence. This is all an effort to turn these co-defendants against Trump and get them to testify against him. But there are other problems with this prosecution other than failure to mention the Presidential Records Act. One is that Jack Smith convened a grand jury which has to investigate these charges before the indictment is issued in Washington, D.C., and not in Miami, Florida, in the Southern District of Florida where the alleged conduct occurred. And he did that because he knew that a D.C. jury and a D.C. judge would be more sympathetic to him than a more neutral judge in Florida. And one of the things Jack Smith did was he forced one of Trump's attorneys to testify about a conversation that Trump had with him about the documents. Normally, you're not allowed to do that. That violates attorney-client privilege, the Sixth Amendment right to counsel in our Bill of Rights. But there is an exception to that right to counsel and to that attorney-client privilege, which is when you are conspiring with your attorney to commit fraud or some kind of crime. So Jack Smith said, well, the Trump attorney was helping Trump conceal these documents, and therefore we can break through this privilege and get the testimony. But if you look at what Trump was asking his attorney, it was about the consequences of various different ways of handling the documents. It wasn't an effort to enlist the attorney's help in defrauding the federal government. It was the kind of question.
No, I'm fascinated by what you're saying, truly, but it seems so ridiculous because all I can think of is, the three words blasting through my head are Hillary Clinton, server. I mean, here it just and not to mention the boxes of classified documents that they found at the University of Pennsylvania and in Joe Biden's office there and in Joe Biden's garage, and they tipped off everybody before they even did executed search warrants so that they were able to clean out other facilities. And whereas Trump was protected by the Presidential Records Act, Hillary was not the president, and neither was Joe Biden. In the time, these were records from their Senate time, or Secretary of State time, his Senate time, his Vice President time. So, I mean, it just seems to me like this is so perverse. Nobody else is getting charged with anything.
And Hillary wasn't charged. Joe Biden wasn't charged. Mike Pence, who also had documents, wasn't charged. And the other thing that may complicate this case is an accusation of misconduct against a fellow named Jay Bratt, who is the head of counterintelligence at the FBI or the Department of Justice. And he allegedly offered one of the lawyers for Trump's co-defendant a judicial position in exchange for getting his client to testify against Trump. The lawyer immediately sent a letter to the judge alleging that this was a serious violation of the rules, and it could actually trip up the entire case if that senior Department of Justice official is found to have made that kind of an offer. So we've now summarized the documents case. Let's get to the other two cases, which are basically the same case. Jack Smith also brought an indictment in Washington, D.C. over Trump's challenges to the 2020 election. What's interesting is that in his public statement, Jack Smith connected Trump's election challenges to the Capitol riot on January 6th. But Jack Smith has not indicted Trump for inciting the riot, and he has not indicted Trump for insurrection or sedition or anything like that. He's just indicting him for what he says is a conspiracy to defraud the United States by making false claims that the election was stolen. Jack Smith says in the indictment that Trump knew the election wasn't stolen, but there's no evidence that Trump knew the election wasn't stolen. There's lots of evidence that Trump believed it was stolen and still believes it was stolen. He'll tell you it was stolen until the cows come home. So it's basically an effort critics like myself have said, to criminalize Republican efforts to challenge the election results legally and constitutionally. It's also an effort to criminalize free speech and political speech, because some of the things in the indictment are quotes from Trump's speeches. Crucially, the indictment quotes Trump's speech on January 6th from Washington, D.C., a mile away from the Capitol, but it leaves out the part where Trump said that people should protest peacefully and patriotically. The Democrats did the same act of omission in the second impeachment trial. They tried to get rid of that phrase, that inconvenient phrase that shows that Trump told people to be peaceful and makes it impossible for them to prosecute him for incitement, because it's not an inciting speech. It's the opposite. The Georgia case that was brought a couple weeks ago by Fani Willis, who is a hardcore left-wing Democrat activist who was elected district attorney in Fulton County, is basically the same. It's basically charging Trump with trying to overturn the election through challenges that she says are criminal, even though everything she describes in the indictment is legal conduct or political speech. It goes far beyond Georgia. She talks about Trump having meetings in Pennsylvania and public hearings in Arizona, and she indicted 18... Well, we don't know. She just made it up. And that's one of the reasons that Mark Meadows, Trump's chief of staff, who was indicted as well, is trying to have the case removed to federal court. And he's saying, look, there's nothing in this indictment that's criminal at all. First of all, I mean, Mark Meadows is indicted as part of a conspiracy because he asked for a phone number. That's literally what he's being indicted for, asking for a phone number, presumably so that Trump could call someone and further his conspiracy of trying to steal the election or whatever. But Meadows said, I was working for the president, and I am immune from prosecution because the president of the United States is immune from criminal prosecution for things that the president does while in office. Therefore, he wants this removed to federal court and immediately dismissed. There are all kinds of other problems with the indictment. As you point out, they indicted 9 of Trump's lawyers. And again, when you look at what the lawyers are accused of doing, it's calling for hearings, asking people to contact their congressional representatives, making legal arguments, writing legal memoranda, none of which are criminal. And the Democrats have been leaking information about all kinds of things to the media. One of the key pieces of evidence is a memo that one of Trump's lawyers wrote outlining the legality or otherwise of challenging the Electoral College votes. But if you read the memo, the lawyer says, I'm not saying we should do this. I'm just giving you the arguments that were this to happen, these are the legal precedents. And so
just his job as a lawyer. I mean, that's John Eastman, and he's also under indictment. And, you know,
there's another one
was subjected to...
Kevin Cheesebro is his name. I may be mispronouncing it, but he's a little less prominent than John Eastman. But the Eastman memo and the Cheesebro memos, these are legal memos. They're not advocacy of a course of action. They're advice from a lawyer. And, you know, lawyers give all kinds of advice, but you're interfering with a basic fundamental right in our Constitution if you're going to prosecute lawyers for giving advice that is not clearly part of some crime. This is not a crime. It's an election challenge.
So I have a hard time not just sitting here and shaking my head. I mean, it's so terrifying, because this is a former president of the United States and the front runner for the GOP nomination, and in some polls the front runner to be elected in the next election to the presidency. And here you have this open Democratic effort to incriminate. They've incriminated him, and they want to put him in jail. And on these charges that on their face are really dubious at a minimum. And, you know, what on earth? I mean, this is America, you know, and you're watching this thing, whether in the United States or around the world, America's just falling apart. I mean, you have the Bidens cooking up all of these influence peddling deals with governments, you know, particularly the Chinese issue, which I don't quite understand why it hasn't gotten so much play. But I mean, everybody in Washington says that China is the chief threat to U.S. national security. And here's the president's son, who is a crackhead, who, while he was a crackhead, signs this deal with a Chinese energy company that is affiliated with the Chinese military and Chinese intelligence. And he's flying back and forth to China on Air Force Two. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, you have you have what's going on with Trump. And I mean, so I guess, I don't know, I guess I've led into what in the hell's going on with America, but I still want to know what's going to happen with the GOP, because, the argument that's being made by people who have always probably opposed Trump, but they're looking at the numbers. I saw Ben Shapiro gave the numbers, and he said, as sympathetic as you are to Trump and to all of his co-defendants in Georgia in particular, you have to look at the numbers, and his unfavorable to favorable rating in the general population is crazy. I mean, it's like 71% unfavorable to 29% favorable or something. I mean, he's got numbers that are worse than Joe Biden, and he's the only Republican running for the nomination whose numbers are that bad. I saw another article in the Washington Examiner that was up on Real Clear Politics today saying that Trump, who did not participate in the GOP debate and instead had a simultaneously broadcast on Twitter interview with Tucker Carlson, that he was harmed by that fact, that his favorability ratings among Republican primary voters went down, and DeSantis's are above his for the first time, I think, and Nikki Haley's went up significantly as well. And so, you have people who I think are opposed to Trump. All the same, they're citing statistical data that has to be borne in mind. That is Trump electable in the general election or not? He's clearly electable among Republicans, but do you want to risk another 4 years of the Democrats in order to seek justice for the president? And on the other side, you have people who are supporting Trump, who are saying, look, you can't run on an anti-establishment agenda more powerful than Trump's, because Trump is the apotheosis he is like the shining example of what the Democrats are trying to do to Republicans. And, he has that famous saying, I'm the only thing saying, however he put it, they're coming after you.
They're coming after you, and I'm in the way.
Right. So that's a great line. And it certainly looks that way when you look at what's happening with the indictment. So it's a sense of justice or injustice of what's being done with him, and seeking justice for Trump, and seeking protection for what happened to him. And the sense that if he doesn't become the next president, that everybody should be running scared. I mean, so there's like this back and forth that is completely rational on the Republican side. It's emotional, but it's also very rational. You're looking at it, and you're looking at this much more closely than I am. I mean, where do you see this? How do you see this playing out with the Republicans?
Well, let's just talk, first of all, about the picture of the American political system this is all painting. If this were happening in another country, we would be issuing State Department releases about it. We would be condemning it like we condemn Russia's prosecution of Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader who just got hit with 19 more years in prison. The irony of the White House condemning the way that Vladimir Putin treats his opponent, while their administration is prosecuting their chief opponent for crimes that could amount to hundreds of years in prison if the sentences were to be the maximum, if they were to run consecutively. So we've lost a lot of moral stature over this, and the Democrats clearly do not care that what they are doing looks like what third world countries and totalitarian countries do to their opponents. The best they can offer is the argument, well, you just don't get to avoid being prosecuted just because you're running for office. You can't use your campaign as a shield against prosecution. Well, I accept that argument, except what he's being prosecuted for, essentially, is running for office. The only reason these prosecutions are happening is because he's running for office. And the purpose of these prosecutions is to push him out of the presidential race. And they're determined to do it by any means available to them. And that's why they've brought the justice system to this low point. I will say something about the mugshot, and then I'll get to your question about the Republican primary. The mugshot changed a lot of things. First of all, because we'd never seen a president of the United States subjected to that kind of indignity before. It is humiliating to see him treated like a common criminal who is being considered a flight risk, who is being considered a future suspect in future crimes, which is one of the reasons they photograph and fingerprint these arrestees, even when they're innocent until proven guilty. But what the mugshot changed is that if Trump does get back into office, because of this level of abuse, he is going to have no restraint whatsoever on his program of reforming the federal government, of possibly dismantling and moving the Department of Justice and the FBI, of eliminating some government departments. There will be no compromise if he is elected, because Democrats have shown they are willing to destroy not just him, but all these other people with him, to destroy the Bill of Rights, to destroy the country, to divide the country. This was a step across a boundary that people are comparing to the Confederacy firing on Fort Sumter, which was the event that launched the Civil War. I don't think we're having a civil war, but once you've crossed that line, there's no going back, and the only alternative for the side being fired upon is complete victory. And so I think if and when Trump becomes president, the mugshot basically means he will have considerable political leeway, certainly from his own party, to do whatever he feels is necessary to make sure that Democrats can never do this again. So there are going to be some very sweeping reforms. I tend to think that energizes the Republican base. It makes it more likely that they're going to come out and vote. You point out the problem that Trump faces in the general election, that he's not very well liked by large portions of the American electorate. I don't know that that makes him different from any other Republican. And people have been saying this for a while, that whoever the prominent Republican is going to get smeared. Look at how they treat Ron DeSantis now. Ron DeSantis showed up at a meeting of citizens in Jacksonville, Florida, where there was a racially motivated shooting, and he was booed by members of the crowd simply for showing up as governor to express his sympathies. So this is how Democrats are going to treat any Republican. But I would also add that the major headwind that any Republican faces in 2020 is the fact that Democratic voters are very, very energized on the issue of abortion. They know that Biden is useless. They know that our economic policies are very weak, that our place in the world has declined precipitously, that our military is weak, that China is a threat. All these other problems exist. Our border is open. But abortion is motivating Democratic voters, and single female voters in particular feel very threatened by the recent decision to overturn Roe versus Wade. They're turning out in droves. In order to defeat that, you have to have a candidate who can bring similar levels of enthusiasm on the Republican side. And thus far, there's no other Republican who can come close to doing it. It's not just that a Republican would be acceptable to the rest of the American electorate. I mean, Nikki Haley would be acceptable. Ron DeSantis might be acceptable. Nikki Haley, in particular, brings the fact that she's a woman and she's a member of a minority and she's extremely experienced and articulate. But there's no other candidate who can generate the same kind of enthusiasm. And so I think what the indictments mean is that the Republican primary is effectively over. That barring some kind of health problem, God forbid, Donald Trump is staying in the race, and he's going to run even if he has to run from prison. And he is going to win the nomination even if he has to be on trial and has to run for office from prison. It's possible he could win the election and that the Chief Justice would have to go to a prison, administer the oath of office to the president in prison, whereupon he would try to pardon himself and then walk out of prison. But right now, Republicans are willing to face that possibility because they are so incensed at what is happening and what Democrats are doing. Now, there's a theory out there that Democrats are doing that on purpose. They're setting Trump up as the nominee because he's the most beatable of the candidates. But the mugshot means it doesn't actually matter, because even if Trump loses, the Republican Party and those who vote for it have seen that Democrats are willing to destroy the system in order to stay in power. And there is an opposition to that that is not going to disappear even if Trump loses and is incarcerated and can't run for office anymore for whatever reason, he's too old or whatever in future elections. There is going to be a reckoning for that mugshot, because not just because it's a photograph, but because it represents how far Democrats have been willing to go. There's a sense among conservatives.
Yes, I mean, let me just stop you here. We're facing something like this in Israel, right? I mean, our left lost power and they're lighting the country on fire and they're trying to destroy Israeli democracy. I mean, next month we're going to have 3 Supreme Court cases on petitions to overturn basic laws, and the Supreme Court has no power to do that, but they're trying to they're pretending that they do, and they intend to overturn amendments to basic laws, the last of which is a basic law that the Knesset passed that prevents the Attorney General from proclaiming the Prime Minister unfit for office unless he's incapacitated, or incapacitated and prevented from fulfilling his office unless he's physically incapacitated, as Ariel Sharon was in 2006 when he had a massive stroke. So she was threatening or hinting that she was planning on deeming Netanyahu incapacitated because he is on trial, and even though the cases against him have completely fallen apart, and while on trial, he's dealing with judicial reform because the justice system in Israel is as corrupt as the justice system is in the United States. And so now she petitioned the court, or left-wing NGOs, I can't remember who she petitioned on one of them, to abrogate the amendment to the basic law, the government of Israel, to give her back the power to declare Netanyahu incapacitated. So next month, we may be facing a situation where the Supreme Court, acting on the basis of no power, declares that the Attorney General has power to deem the Prime Minister incapacitated because she doesn't like the way he's governing, and she intends to use it. So this is where we are in Israel. So I totally get, the idea that people will be angry at the mugshot and they're not going to forgive even if Trump loses the election. The question is, so what? Because the whole point is to keep power. The whole point is to keep the Republicans out of power and to keep these woke, radical, scary Democrats in power. And if they're willing to go to this length, why would you think that they would stop anywhere? And that's why, it's in Israel, in America, elections have become zero-sum games. When one side says that they won't accept the legitimacy of their elections unless they win, then you're dealing with a post-democratic society, and so I don't know what it means when you say that the Republicans will not forgive this. If they're out of power, who cares?
So there's a lot in what you're saying, and let me observe, coming back to a point that we talked about at the beginning, that you could be right, that Democrats could in fact hold on to power and they could defeat Trump this way and they could do whatever they want afterwards. We see that has already happened in part of the United States. There hasn't been a Republican elected in most of America's major cities in many, many decades. As a result, most of America's major cities are falling apart. San Francisco, which until somewhat recently was viewed as a jewel in Silicon Valley, has basically been abandoned. The center of the city is empty if you go there. The same is true of many other American cities. I was in Chicago recently over the summer. The city is quiet during the day. It's not completely empty like San Francisco is, but it is quiet. New York has revived somewhat, and Los Angeles is spread out enough that it's still viable. But downtown Los Angeles is the zombie apocalypse, with tens of thousands of homeless people essentially taking over the city. That's what happens in a one-party system where you have no opposition and no contestation of these radical left-wing ideas. So what Republicans have done is essentially abandoned the cities and moved to the suburbs and to other states. Democrats are chasing them to those states because Democrats with high incomes are trying to get away from the problems they themselves have created. So it's a question of how much longer you can outrun that. But what I think happens in these situations is that if the left gets its way, it will have power, but power over what? And what happens is you start to see a kind of attrition in a society, and that attrition makes the society unlivable. So Democrats, let's take San Francisco. Democrats have complete control of San Francisco. And what do they control? They control a city that is basically failed, where the city's own experts are talking about demolishing commercial buildings and putting up amusement parks because there's no other way to get people to come back to the city. So if you allow yourself, if you're on the left, to win, it's a Pyrrhic victory, or it's an empty victory, because you're winning something that's no longer worth having. It's a poisoned chalice. So if Democrats can keep Donald Trump out of the presidency through these maneuverings, even if the more establishment Republicans are correct that Trump proves unelectable and so forth, there is no way that the majority of Republican voters will consider this election legitimate. And this is not a case of rejecting any election. This is a case where the Republican voters have seen that their candidate has been subjected to these dozens and dozens of criminal charges, all of which are without merit, and the trial dates are set during the primary election season, and so on and so forth, while Joe Biden and his family get away with everything. Nobody will accept the election result on the Republican side. And there's nothing that anyone can do. It has nothing to do with fraud or ballot boxes being stuffed or vote by mail or anything like that. Republicans understand that this is not a free and fair election, and that unless they can marshal the resources to come out and defeat the Democrats by what people refer to somewhat jokingly as the margin of fraud, that unless Republicans can do that, this election is going to be rigged, and there's no way Republicans are going to accept the outcome. So Democrats will have power, but they'll have power over an increasingly uncooperative country that will not bend to their whims and dictates. I mean, you can create all the transgender bathrooms you want, for example, but it's not going to turn men into women. So this is what Democrats get if they win, and I think the same is true in Israel. And I think if I can try to give you my perspective a little bit on what's happening in Israel, and I'm looking forward to being there next month and seeing for myself. But I think the border was crossed, certainly as an observer and supporter of Israel, but the line was crossed when the reservists said that they weren't going to show up for military duty. And I have to say, as someone who supports Israel, it was deeply shocking to me that anybody who could help defend Israel would decide not to do that for political reasons and then claim that they were doing that in the name of democracy, when that act itself is an anti-democratic act. And I think that united Netanyahu's government to pass at least the first of the reforms. It basically underlined what was at stake here, that if you yielded to those kinds of tactics, the country was lost. And I think the same is happening here in the United States. If we allow this abuse of the justice system to continue, the country will not continue. It will be overtaken by China, perhaps even invaded militarily by China or commercially dominated by China and other interests, and we will lose the free society that we enjoy and that the world depends on. So I think there is going to be some kind of reckoning. I don't think America will choose to commit national suicide in that way. And I think that you're going to start to see some of even the establishment Republicans who hate Trump start to say that reluctantly they have to support him. There was a very interesting moment when Trump's former Attorney General, Bill Barr, who now hates Trump and wrote a whole book against Trump and is on every Sunday show attacking Trump, he was asked on one of these Sunday show interviews, well, you're attacking Trump so much, will you vote for him if the choice is Trump and Joe Biden? And he said he hadn't decided yet, which tells you that even some of these people understand what's at stake. They just want Trump somehow voluntarily to leave so that it doesn't look like what it is, which is that the Democrats are trying to rig the election. They would prefer that Trump cooperate in his own self-isolation, self-destruction, so that they can create the idea that this election is now a contest between one legitimate candidate and a whole bunch of illegitimate and failing Democrats. But that's not really going to
I want to cut you off for a second. I'd like to get your last comments, because I want to, one of the things that I found interesting, that there was a lot that I found interesting about the GOP candidates debate. One of them was the sense that it was just so detached from reality because they weren't really talking about what was happening with Trump. But there was an exchange between Vivek Ramaswamy and Mike Pence that I thought was really notable, which was that Ramaswamy said to Pence, you're acting like this is Reagan's Morning in America moment. And I've never in my lifetime felt that I was living in that America. And, we are at we're in a cultural civil war, and we're in a cold civil war. And, and we have to recognize this. And Pence was saying, on the other hand, he was absolutely disagreeing with him and saying there's nothing wrong with the American people. The American people are, because Vivek Ramaswamy was claiming that American values have been eroded, and belief in God and hard work and perseverance and the American dream. And Mike Pence said that's absolutely wrong. Americans are the most God-fearing, hardworking, optimistic, whatever people that we've ever known. Our only problem is that we have a bad government. We got a good government, and that's worthy of the people, and everything will be fine. And this struck me really as the real fault line in the Republican Party between the so-called establishment GOP and the so-called populist GOP, because here you had exactly the line of fissures. Has the American dream been destroyed by what's happening in the cultural wars and in the politicization of the justice system, et cetera, and everything that we've been seeing, and or is it just fine? And really, what we need is a president who knows how to manage government better, a more standard type of person at the head of the Republican Party. And I think that, if you can you bring it together with answering that question, I think would be a good way to end this. I find fascinating conversation with you. So
the answer is that they're both right. Pence is right that Americans are still the most God-fearing, hardworking nation in the world. Ramaswamy is right that they have declined, or we have declined in those values from where we were even 20 years ago. 20 years ago, you could speak about the American birth rate as being an exception to the general decline in the Western world. And now we are looking at Eastern Europe levels of collapse, post-communist levels of collapse. Young people are no longer having children, which means they're not optimistic about the future. They don't think they can afford their own lifestyles. They're not experiencing happiness and love. They're not willing to face life's most important challenges, which aren't political. They're really personal for most of us, and even for the greatest and biggest and most powerful among us, the biggest and most fulfilling things we do in our lives are often personal. But we're no longer raising a generation that is bold enough to face those challenges. So while we have that problem less severely than most other countries, we also have that problem. And I think one of the interesting points of commonality between Israel and the United States is that our lives have been fundamentally upended by, first of all, by terror. I think we need to acknowledge that many of the changes we've seen over the last 20 years have happened since the Second Intifada in Israel and since the 9/11 attacks in the United States. And I think that there has been a kind of trauma that we haven't really acknowledged that has crept into everything we do in response to a confrontation with people who want to destroy us, some of whom live among us. And that's, I think, something that's not really thought about very often. But then the other thing is the arrival of social media. And I'm not hostile to transgenderism as an expression of identity among adults. What is frightening to me is not just that it's appearing in schools and we're told that children can have transgender identities when they're not even of an age to know anything about sex at all, for example, but that there are entire subcultures where this is entirely embraced and normalized. The transgender phenomenon basically appears in the United States in this massive way at the same time as the introduction of the smartphone, and in particular, TikTok. So you have to ask what effect some of these social media platforms are having on our society. And I think the same is true in Israel, not so much because of transgenderism, but whenever I talk to Israelis, and I have relatives who live in Tel Aviv, some of whom are at these protests and they're upset about the judicial reform, and when I ask them why they're upset, they can't say. And the reasons they give are all big cultural issues that have nothing to do with the judicial reform. And that might just be because my relatives are not particularly political and maybe they're not used to talking about politics, but I found the same experience even when I listened to the arguments of experienced political writers and commentators, that they have a real problem articulating their opposition. So I'm wondering if so many of us are living in an alternate reality that is constructed for us by social media and by our smartphones, which have become ubiquitous accessories, and we're not actually dealing with reality as it's lived, and it's making us depressed, and it's giving us an inability to function, and it's allowing our societies to collapse into different media bubbles, different political bubbles. And I'm not saying we should censor social media. I'm very skeptical of how that would happen and who would make those kinds of decisions. But we haven't yet developed the practices that can counter it. I mean, in my own family, the observance of Shabbat is very important because it disconnects the kids from the devices for 25 hours, which is not something most other kids have. But, just to use my daughter's example, she just started a new Jewish school here in Los Angeles, and the parents who have given their children the smartphones, the iPhone and so forth, or the Samsungs or whatever, they can't get their kids off these phones. And in fact, they feel they've lost their children. We gave my daughter a phone, which we call a dumb phone, which basically just makes phone calls and sends text messages in case we need to pick her up somewhere and that kind of thing. And that's for safety and so forth, and so she can talk to friends. But the smartphone era, where we witness other people living lives that we idealize, where we see women in particular modeling various forms of behavior that girls start to imitate, where we see boys transitioning to become women, and maybe there are boys who find that a compelling form of expression, and that's an identity for many of these kids who are lacking some other structure. I don't think we have figured out yet what this has done to our societies. And I think if there's a common crisis in Israel and the United States, it's not just a weaponization of the justice system and the legal profession against democratically elected leaders with populist policies, but it's also the fact that social media is making it impossible for many of us to function, not just politically, but in our own families.
It's so interesting that you say that, because one of Trump's speeches that I think the speech that he made that had the greatest impact on me and draw me to him probably for the first time in a significant way was his speech at the Republican convention in 2016 when he accepted the nomination, because he gave a speech where he was presenting the United States, not necessarily as a dystopia, but as something approaching that with the ravaging of America's major cities and of the urban poor. And, I grew up in Chicago's Hyde Park neighborhood, and my high school was an inner city public school, the one that Barack Obama would never have sent his daughters to, actually, because he lived in our neighborhood, and that would have been their school as well if he hadn't been elected. And it was certainly the first time that I ever heard a Republican talking about the ravaging of America's cities and the problems of the urban poor in such a compelling way, or really in such a caring way. And I thought that really distinguished him from every other Republican politician I ever heard. And I also thought that it made sense because the situation was far different from 1984's Reagan's Morning in America, which is why I also kind of found what Ramaswamy said very compelling. But I think that the ability to communicate the nature of the moment that people are experiencing in the United States is so important. And in a way, the encapsulation of that, to a very large degree, is Trump's mugshot. Everybody was talking about how, it's this great mugshot. He looks totally determined, and he spent. Again, I was watching what Ben Shapiro was saying about that Trump has been photographed since he was in his 20s, and now he's nearly 80, or he's 80. I don't know how old he is, and so he knows how to do photography better than anybody, and it's just perfect. It was a perfect picture. It was a mugshot, the greatest mugshot in the history of humanity. And I felt like, again, this is all just image making. It's all like there's something so sick behind that image that you've described so eloquently in this conversation. And it's this images, it's what you see, what touches you, what doesn't touch you. And so much of this isn't even real to begin with. And then what really is real, the urban poor, the desolation of Chicago. We were just spent a month there, and we never went downtown because why would I want to, subject my kids to that? There's too much shooting going on there. But you look at what's happening in America's cities, and you just say, my God. Where is America going? Here you have a former president, front runner for GOP nomination, or really the nominee already. You can almost say it by acclamation. And the strongest candidate, certainly he's not senile, which is different from Joe Biden, to be the next president of the United States. And yet, and then it just seems like everything is broken. you know?
Look at Biden's family. If you want to understand the problem, he's a guy who always talks about how much family means to him, and he quotes apocryphal stories about his father and grandfather, and he says you can always trust a Biden and that sort of thing, like as if his family is so important to him. I think one of the things we're going to find as we get more of the details of this is that Hunter Biden is not just a quote-unquote crackhead or whatever. He's not just someone who is trying to obtain millions of dollars to support his lifestyle and live this flashy existence with women and drugs and cars and that kind of thing. I think we will find, to an astonishing extent, that Joe Biden manipulated his son and that he enabled his son's addictions and that he put his son deliberately into these situations where his son was essentially the bag man for the family. And I think we will find that Joe Biden is culpable in some of Hunter Biden's madness and sadness. And I think that the reality is hinted to us in the fact that Biden wouldn't even acknowledge Hunter Biden's illegitimate child as a seventh grandchild until Democrats started criticizing him on the pages of the New York Times for failing to do so. So we've been presented with this image of a family man who cares about family, and yet there's no empathy at all, to the point of enabling, I believe, his son's addiction, preventing his son from moving beyond this phase of his life. And he just manipulates and uses him to bring the money into the family because he's at significant arm's length, and so he can do these transactions without touching Uncle Joe or Papa Joe or whatever. But you talk about the mugshot image. Look, I also think it was a strong image. The image of that mugshot was the image we've seen so many times on Donald Trump's face before he became a politician. That's the image of Donald Trump on Celebrity Apprentice right before he fires somebody. So what you're seeing is a prisoner in that moment, but he's actually, in many ways, in full control. That mugshot gives him authority to fire everybody once he comes back into office, if he does so. But, talking about the world of images, I'm immersed in that world. I live in Hollywood. Well, I live near Hollywood. I live in Los Angeles, but I'm surrounded by people who work in Hollywood, who work with images. They're my neighbors, the other parents at school, and so forth. And many of them can afford to live quite traditional lives. Traditional life in this country has been a luxury of the upper middle class and wealthier than that. What's happened in the last 20 or 30 years is the dissolution of traditional American values among the poor, particularly among poor white Americans. That's been documented by Charles Murray and others. And what's happening, even though many people here in Los Angeles have traditional single-family homes and they send their kids to nice private schools and so forth, our culture industry is not reflecting the values that we prefer to live by in our everyday lives. And I don't think our young people understand anymore what it means to be loved, to be in love. I don't think they understand even something as, if you want to put it this way, as base as sexual pleasure, because we have all this sexual liberation. You can choose your gender, never mind your sexual preference. You can choose your gender identity from not just one of two choices, but a million different choices. And yet statistics tell us that Americans are not just having fewer babies, but they're actually having less sex in or out of marriage. So there's all this emphasis on sexual identity, but there's no emphasis on pleasure. There's no emphasis on beauty. There's no emphasis on the things that have motivated human beings throughout the ages. And one of your other recent guests, Yoram Hazony, made this point very, very well, where he pointed out that American kids and Israeli kids are no longer exposed to the Bible. So kids don't grow up hearing pru or vu. They don't hear be fruitful and multiply. And it's a striking insight that he has, which is that even though we spend so much energy trying to stop sexual harassment in the workplace, which I think is a good thing to stop, we spend so much energy restraining these improper and inappropriate expressions of sexual behavior. People don't seem to actually take any interest in the legitimate kind of sexual behavior unless they're told by an authority to do it, and the authority is missing from their lives. And so I think the crisis is as much one of happiness as it is of anything else. And these left-wing movements spring up in the vacuum to offer people another way to be happy, or more often, they offer people something to hate, which fills the vacuum that love once filled. And so for the left, hating Trump has become a cosmology. And that's why I don't even think there has to be coordination between all these different indictments. I mean, there probably is, but I don't even think it has to happen that way, that you could see, look at Alvin Bragg, the first indictment in New York. all of the people who hate Trump were out criticizing the indictment, not because they didn't want to see Trump indicted, not because they thought the substance was wrong. They just felt it looked too political, so it was going to ruin the other indictments. They don't have the ability really to control some of this stuff because it's in the zeitgeist. It's in the culture they've created. Trump is the demon, and if they can get rid of the demon, then they can be happy, or they can be at least a little less miserable. But there's a vacuum in their lives.
Well, that's an awful lot. That's an awful lot like BB derangement syndrome here. And I think you're also describing very well all the lonely people showing up on Saturday nights on Kaplan Street in Tel Aviv, where you just have, I think it was Elisha Haas, who's a guest on my show last week. He gave an interview in another podcast where he was talking about just how, they've substituted a herd for a community. They are members of a herd that are driven by mass hysteria, and they're mistaking their membership in a herd for membership in a community that they don't have. And to a degree that they did have it, they destroyed it over politics. So, I think that you're getting that here. I think you're getting it there, and God save us both. And I think we're going to have to leave it at that because we've probably gone on too long, and my editors are going to be going, Caroline, it's an hour and 21 minutes. And, how are we going to cut this thing? But anyway, so Joel, I couldn't stop talking to you because it was fascinating, and we're talking about things that are so important. And I wish that when you were in Israel, you would be able to come into our studio, but I understand it'd be difficult. So I think I might have to have you back on again to not talk specifically about the election, but about all of the cultural issues that we're facing in Israel and the United States. But we'll do that for another time. And in the meantime, thanks so much for your sage interpretations and commentary on what's happening here. And you guys should all be following Joel as well at Breitbart. And where else are you showing up in your locals?
I have a locals page, and you can also just follow me on Twitter at Joel Pollak.
Which I do too. So yeah, at Joel Pollak on Twitter. All right, so we'll see you guys again next week, and we'll see Joel in Israel soon. And see you again next week. We'll have another very interesting guest, but I'm not telling you who it is because it's not completely booked yet. So I'll talk to you later. Take care. Bye-bye.